Stand by for VOG. Go VOG.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily.
By for VOG. And go VOG.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Okay. please welcome the Atlantic's Patrick Garrigan.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am Patrick Garrigan, Executive Director at AtlanticLIVE, the events division of The Atlantic. It is wonderful to see you all this morning on this very warm spring morning on today's Summit on Artificial Intelligence. This morning, we're focusing on how artificial intelligence is changing so many aspects of public life, in the environment, in healthcare, and in national security. Today, you'll hear from the very people in charge of this momentous shift. We'll talk about the ways in which AI can make our health data work more efficiently to provide better treatment, and how it can help us find new solutions for energy technologies. We'll also hear from a congressman worried about how facial recognition could be used. As you can tell, the possibilities for success are endless, and so too are the possibilities for abuse. By the end, we hope you'll come away better informed with new ideas, an increased understanding of what's possible, and perhaps, most importantly, what to watch out for. To give you a better sense of who you're all sitting next to here in the room, we are so grateful to be joined by policy experts, business leaders, privacy advocates, and students. And we want to hear from you all. At the end of every panel, we'll be sure to make time for questions, so start thinking of some fantastic ones right now. I'd like to take a moment to thank Microsoft for making this morning possible. We are so grateful for their support of these conversations. So give them a quick round of applause there. Thank you very much. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out their display just behind you. Some really remarkable technology back there. By way of some quick housekeeping, please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away. We want you to participate in the conversation on Twitter. You can tag us using the handle @AtlanticLIVE. That's @AtlanticLIVE, all one word, and using the hashtag that you see all around me, #IntelligentFuture. We begin with a conversation about efforts on the Hill to regulate AI. For that, please welcome Representative Jimmy Gomez from California, and joining him here on stage is journalist Jean Meserve.
Welcome. Great to have you with us.
Good morning.
So we're going to talk about marrying up artificial intelligence with cameras, which gives us facial recognition, a technology which law enforcement argues is a great tool for good, but privacy advocates have a different point of view. Congressman, you have had your own personal experience with facial recognition. Tell us about that.
Well, last summer, the ACLU conducted a test with the photographs of members of Congress. And those tests showed a lot of misidentification and matching with different mugshots. And I remember the day because my comms director got a phone call from somebody in the media and said, hey, the ACLU conducted a test. Your boss was in it. Do you have a comment? And he asked for the results. And they're like, well, we don't have the results. Is there a comment? So we ended up, he came and told me, and I'm like, let me guess. It was mostly people of color and minorities that were misidentified. And later on, we found out that was exactly the case. Not only myself, but John Lewis, mostly members who were in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus or the CBC or the Congressional Black Caucus were the ones that were misidentified. So it wasn't a shock to me, and I think it's because earlier that year I went to a South by Southwest, my first time in South by Southwest, and I went to a workshop on diversity in tech. And some people were making the argument the lack of diversity in tech shows up in the products. And it kind of stuck with me, so when I saw the firsthand result, I was thinking, wow, this could be very, very bad, especially when technology is being integrated with body cameras or potentially, and the use of that technology with law enforcement. What does it mean for our communities?
Well, what does it mean? Where do you think it could lead?
Well, one of the things we know for a fact, that we've seen it, that interactions with the minority communities, if you're black or brown, you're more likely to end up in a situation that is life-changing, right? Or cost you your life. So if this misidentification increases the likelihood that you're going to get stopped, then that's a big concern because it can change the impact my constituents. It can impact countless Americans in a very negative way.
Worst case scenario?
Death. When you would get pulled over by a police officer in the minority community, there is a lot of concern. I've had friends, when they get pulled over, they stick their hands out the window, right? So we know it's a real life serious consequence if things go wrong. So worst case scenario, somebody gets pulled over, they're misidentified because they thought it was this person. Maybe it's somebody they're looking for somebody that's committed murder. They get pulled over, the interaction goes wrong, and that person dies.
The tech industry says we can fix that. Do you have confidence that they will?
Not yet. And the reason why is that I started asking questions and sending out around a letter last year, just trying to get answers to just some basic questions. And we've been working with the ACLU to ask these questions, and they just haven't been that forthright. They've come to the office, and I'll be very honest. I was last year in the House, I was the 435th member in seniority. I was sort of like, so out of 435, I was like dead last.
It improves.
Yeah,
it does improve.
Now I'm 336. And I was on natural resources, which is not a very powerful committee, and I was on oversight in the minority. In the minority, not a very powerful committee. So the responses were kind of lacking, but the minute we switched to being in the majority and being on oversight, which is a very powerful committee when you're in the majority, and then on Ways and Means, all of a sudden their response has changed. They started coming back with meetings, coming back and trying to answer our questions, but they're still lacking. But I still think that they're coming from California. We got to ask the tough questions. Like, are we stumbling into the darkness and not understanding what we're walking into?
And do you think we are?
I think we are. I think we are. So it is up to, I think, policymakers to ask those tough questions and then to have a debate in public if there should be limitations on the use of that technology.
So you've talked about the discriminatory aspects of this. Are you also concerned about the privacy implications here?
Of course.
What's being collected? By whom? How's it being used? How long is it being kept?
Yeah, one of the things, I served in the California State Legislature for 4.5 years, and I was the chair of appropriations, but that committee would really dealt with money, but it dealt with all pieces of legislation. And one of the big debates when I was there is the use of body cameras, and oftentimes with law enforcement. And the questions are the same. Who owns the data? Where is it stored? What can be done with it? Who can review it? It's the same thing when it comes to facial recognition. Who is actually the owner of that data, right? Who can they sell it? How do they use it? Where is it stored? What happens if there's a breach? A lot of questions that have to be asked and answered. Right now, I think we're kind of in the wild, wild west of facial recognition where, sort of anything goes. And there's some companies that are out there that see no limitations. Other companies that understand, we got to tread lightly on this issue.
And we look at what's happening in other countries. There's been a lot of publicity about China and how China is using facial recognition to control its Uyghur minority population. Do you have fear that something like that could actually happen here in the United States?
I think there's a real fear that there could be a chilling effect on people's right to exercise their First Amendment rights, right? The right to protest, the right to assemble, not only on the left but on the right. And I think that might be the nexus where there's agreement between Republicans and Democrats on how should this new technology be used and what should be the limitations. We're going to have a hearing on the Oversight Committee on Wednesday on this issue. It's going to be the first hearing that we've held on this issue. I asked for it back in February, and the reason why the committee agreed to do it is that it is a bipartisan issue, that the Republicans actually wanted to work on this issue as well. So it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans alike. And also, I want to be very clear. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not anti-innovation. But I understand that we have to balance people's civil liberties with security. And a new technology that's emerging, how it used does matter.
San Francisco has taken a dramatic step here and said, whoa, not here, not with government agencies. Is that the right step for that city to take? And should other cities, states, and federal government follow suit?
Yeah, I'm not surprised San Francisco did that. I was in
Because
dealing with some tech companies, there seems to be an arrogance that they can fix anything, and that they don't have to be responsive to elected officials, and that they can kind of like slow walk us, and the issue will go away. I had that situation with the tech company, and I knew that this issue wouldn't go away, just by my gut, because I've been in an elected office for a while, and I've seen issues kind of percolate, and all of a sudden, the public awareness of that issue increases, and as it increases, so does the awareness of the elected officials. I was visited by my former colleagues in the state legislature from California, and they asked me, what are you working on? I talked about a variety of issues, and I mentioned facial recognition. And they said, oh yeah, we're looking at that as well. So I knew that was on people's radar. And when companies do not respond, or they don't get sufficient answers to our questions, like, is there an inherent bias in your data set? Is there, just answering a bunch of questions and they're not responsive, then elected officials take a step. And that's why I'm not surprised.
is a ban a step too far?
I'm not yet. I don't think it's necessarily, I don't think it is. And I think that is sometimes sometimes companies, by their lack of action, determine their own fate. And that's what I think happened in San Francisco. In the California legislature, Phil Ting introduced a bill that will prohibit the integration of facial recognition technology with police body cameras, right? So we're going to see that it's going to happen more and more across the country, California, and I think that the companies are going to have to decide how they respond.
Well, the tech companies themselves have said, regulate us, set up some guardrails for us. Are they sincere?
I hope they're sincere. I know, I think it was Microsoft that asked for that. At the same time, oftentimes when they ask for guardrails, when you go to put guardrails, they're like, those are a little too narrow. Can you widen them out a little bit? Their tune changes a little bit. So we'll see. But I'm glad that they recognize some companies are taking steps, understanding that there has to be some oversight on the use of that technology, and they have a responsibility. But not all companies see that.
Do you have some thoughts on where those guardrails should be placed?
I think right now, I would think it would be appropriate not to use the technology when it comes to law enforcement. And that's because of how it can be used. There's been examples. I read an article about the New York Police Department, a witness say that a suspect looked like Woody Harrelson, so they took his photo and uploaded it to their database in order to find that person. They also other police departments took police sketches, right? Took a police sketch and then put it into the database to look for a suspect. And I'm not sure if people know, but eyewitness testimony is often some of the weakest. Like the studies have consistently shown is the weakest when it comes to finding the right individual. So there's a lot of concerns, especially if you can put a drawing into a system and think that that looks like a person and that's how they're going to find them.
But there are other examples where it has been a valuable tool for law enforcement, and it has helped them find criminals. Happened not far from here with the Annapolis newspaper shooting.
Yeah.
Facial recognition helped them find this individual.
Yeah, and there is there is examples of that, but people have to decide, like I said, how much of their liberties are they willing to give up, right? And if Ted Bundy's been on Netflix quite a bit. Imagine if we had facial recognition back in the day, and we could have found Ted Bundy a lot quicker. Would people would have supported that? I think they would have, but I think that at the same time, when it comes to this technology, you got to understand that it is still flawed.
Aren't there ways to establish boundaries that where individuals are consenting to having their images used, where there's transparency about how they're being used, about how long they're being held, that would allow this to still be a tool that law enforcement and government could use.
Yeah, there is, but there has to be a debate about that, and the debate is not occurring.
It's not even on Capitol Hill.
No, not really. A little bit. You see, Brian Schatz and another person, I think, introduced legislation. It's starting to occur because we're having that first hearing and oversight on Wednesday. It's a big concern. I think that not only policymakers are concerned, shareholders are starting to be concerned. Amazon shareholders are going to have a vote on Wednesday if they should continue down this road or not.
Do you think the regulation, if there is regulation, should be done at the federal level? Should it be done state? Should it be done locally?
If Congress fails to act, it will be done at the state level. I come from California. I don't try to say that California shouldn't put restrictions on facial recognition, but they will act, and the states have a right to act, and the municipalities have a right to act if Congress fails to take appropriate measures.
Does Congress have the smarts to do it? No offense to you, but we have all witnessed some hearings on the Hill that have displayed to us in shocking clarity the lack of technical knowledge of some members of Congress.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things I've always said is that members of Congress, elected officials, don't know everything. And as long as you recognize that your limitations on what you know and what you don't know, and you rely on staff and experts and different advocates to help guide the discussion, that's where we want to go. One of the problems I always say, the difficulties of trying to regulate tech, is what happens when the text changes, right? What happens when it's no longer...
It evolves very quickly.
Yeah, and your legislation is static. So that is one of the biggest challenges when dealing with emerging technologies, is how you develop a regulatory system that promotes innovation but then has those guardrails to protect people's civil liberties. Why is it, and this is a good question, is like, why is it when it comes to autonomous vehicles, we've taken a very cautious path forward, right? Autonomous vehicles, and I think it's because it's obvious, an autonomous vehicle, if it crashes, it takes out a person, right? It can kill them instantly. Facial recognition, it doesn't seem that serious, but it is serious. And the consequences can be just as dramatic as somebody getting hit by a driverless car. So it's still something that we're struggling with, but I think the discussion is emerging.
Another question is, if you regulate, what are the penalties? Facebook was just facing a penalty of, $5 billion from the FTC? They hardly blinked.
Yeah.
So how do you establish something that's
that's
going to be effective?
Yeah, that's a question that I would want to have answered by some of the people that have been working on these issues. I haven't. And it's interesting. I only got involved last year, and there's no one really working on this issue, right? And I'm not an attorney. I haven't been on the Hill that long, but I can recognize a problem when I see it, and this is a problem. And one of the things I would love to see is dealing with law enforcement. We can't say, hey, Microsoft, Amazon, you can't develop this technology. I don't think we should do that. But we can say to law enforcement agencies, you cannot use this data. If you do, if we come to the conclusion that they can, then we can say, okay, you can only use it in these instances. You can only use it with these data sets. You can't enter sketches into the system. You can't use celebrity mugshots or celebrity photos. We can put restrictions. And that's what they've done when it comes to police body cameras, and I think it's reasonable.
So you're not saying you want to take this tool away from law enforcement entirely. You just want to make sure they're using it properly. Am I correct here?
I think correct. And first, I haven't decided what steps to actually take, and that's what some of the discussions are about. If the hearings produce a situation where I think I'm still worried about it, then I might say the moratorium on the use of facial recognition for law enforcement might be appropriate, and I might back that. But I haven't determined that as the course of action yet.
We're going to be taking your questions in just a minute, so get your thoughts together on that. We've talked a lot about governmental use of facial recognition, but it's all over in the private sector as well, isn't it?
It is.
And is that of concern to you? And
I know-
how do you get a handle on that?
I know that there's, for my personal opinion, it's not as big of a concern as it is for the law enforcement aspect of it. But if I walk into a store and it recognizes me, and then it takes my information, but it tries to sell me like a pair of jeans I don't like, that's not going to bother me too much. It's really the interaction with law enforcement, or is it tracking me when it comes to exercising my First Amendment right to protest, freedom of speech. That's more concerning for me. But I know the arguments that people say that your face is going to become like your fingerprint, right? And do you want that information out there? What responsibilities do the private sector have of these companies when it comes to breaches of their data? If there is a breach, can they be held liable for your information getting out there? Those are good questions, and I don't have the answers to them.
We didn't touch on border security. A little bit later, we're going to be talking to someone from DHS. They say, hey, we've got to know who's coming into the country, and this gives us an ability to screen, perhaps match with photographs that are in the terrorist databases. Do you endorse that use of facial recognition?
I haven't decided, and it depends. On the borders, I'm a little bit more open. You don't have a right necessarily to just go on to a flight without people knowing who you are, but also people opt in, right? If you're crossing the border, you're sort of opting in to coming into this country. At the same time, when you're going to take a plane, I signed up for Clear. I use Clear, but I opted in for the convenience of getting through. But the question is, my data, what are they going to do with it? Are they allowed to sell it? Are they allowed to, or is it just for that particular use? Terms of agreement, let's face it, most of us don't read the fine print when it comes to...
We don't understand the fine print.
And most of us don't even read it to see if we understand it or not. So I think those are legitimate questions to have, but we got to have those we have to have those discussions on those questions.
We have a few moments here to take some questions from the audience. There are a couple of folks with microphones out in the audience. I believe I see someone right over here. If you could give us your name and your affiliation as well as your question, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Nicole Coomber. I am an associate clinical professor at the University of Maryland Business School. I want to thank you first for your candor. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that a lack of diversity in technology shows up in their products. And so I wanted to see if you had thoughts on how we can improve the lack of diversity in technology, but also what are some other products that you've seen where you think this is maybe not quite as harmful as resulting in death, like facial recognition, but maybe some other areas where it's affecting the products that we use?
No, good question. That was a statement that I heard from a panelist at South by Southwest, and it did strike me as true. At the same time, when you look at the products that are being developed, they sometimes don't seem to appeal. I don't have any specifics off the top of my head. This is what I've been focusing on. But I think that in order to get more diversity in tech, you have to do more kind of STEM outreach to particular communities. You have to have specific targets to hire specific individuals. You can have what they call the Rooney Rule, which I didn't know what it was until last year, where you interview a person from a woman for every position at the top, or you interview a minority for every position at the top. Doesn't mean
what the NFL does with coaches.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that they get it, but they open up that possibility. So it is a potential. Most people that are people of color, are lower income, working class. They don't often go to the schools that have these kind of programs, STEM, computer science. So they're less likely to get into that. Greater investment in those programs in the schools might help. But diversity in tech is something that people have claimed that it shows up in their products. On facial recognition, it has proven true. And I think that that's just because of a lack of awareness from the very, very, very beginning of the development of that technology. But those are some ideas. But off the top of my head, I can't think of all the products, but facial recognition is the number one off the top of my head.
Another question out there. Do I see any hands? Yes.
Hi, yes. My name is Andrea Muskin. I'm Vice President of Partnerships at Partnership for a Healthier America. We work with private sector partners to provide healthier options for Americans. And so you mentioned that, for facial recognition in retail, if they're trying to sell you a pair of jeans, you don't really care about that. But what about in the grocery retail? If you're a low-income American and the grocery retail is using facial recognition to give you discounts on foods that are not healthier, is that something that would be concerned in the potential for continued health disparities with the use of this technology?
Not sure. And I'll just, the reason why is that they do that anyways, right? And there's so many, I'm a big proponent about the social determinants of health, right? Understanding that the lack of access to grocery stores where they have vegetables and produce of all types at affordable cost have an impact. Where people live have an impact on their health. I get that, but at the same time, I'm not sure if that is my biggest concern when it comes to this issue of facial recognition. It doesn't mean that it's not a concern, it's just not my biggest concern. But the social determinants of health are still a big deal. I get that. We just had a hearing on it last week.
I think we have time for one more quick question right here.
Hi, good morning. My name is John. I work at a software company. And just a slightly intentionally provocative question for you. First of all, thank you for being here. And what I'd like to know is, why is it legal for software companies to use data provided by minors, by people who are under 18 years old and therefore can't do all the stuff that adults can do, like sign contracts? Why is it legal for companies to make money using their data?
I have no idea.
Is this for
just no, honestly, I really don't. But it is a good question, right? We've seen some uses of. I heard of a test of coming up with some of a data set when it came to images, and and this is something that we're going to look into, that it was images of victims of sexual abuse, mugshots of crime scenes, right? And we have to ask ourselves, is that also legitimate uses of those images, right? I don't have the answers to those questions yet. I think it's something that we all have to have a discussion around, and then hopefully we'll come to some logical conclusion. But there is no easy answer of yes, no, this is right, this is wrong. It is really bringing up those concerns and having that debate. I think a lot of, and as I mentioned before, I'm not anti-tech, right? But at the same time, when it comes to big issues, like your right to be able to walk down the street and not have anybody know who you are, I think it still matters in this country. It should matter in this country. No, we're not China, and I thank God that we're not China. But there should be some limitations to protect those individuals' rights. We're not there, so watch the hearing on Wednesday, because there's going to be a lot of discussion between the Republicans, and these are far right-wing Republicans, and far left Democrats. And I'm curious to see what the questions and the answers are.
And we'll be watching. Congressman, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much.
For a conversation on building ethical artificial intelligence tools, please welcome Tom Gann, Chief Policy Officer for McAfee. Meredith Broussard, author and professor at New York University, and Chris Calabrese, Vice President of Policy for the Center for Democracy and Technology. To lead the discussion, please welcome Atlantic Senior Editor Ross Anderson.
Chris, Meredith, Tom, thanks for being with us here this morning. Meredith, I want to start with you to frame our discussion. We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, as you know, and you have this really provocative way of kind of summing up the flaws with AI by saying that AI fundamentally misunderstands the world. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about what you mean by that? And then I was hoping that, Tom and Chris, you might respond to that.
Great, thanks. So the book is about the inner workings and outer limits of technology. And one of the things that I discovered through teaching computational methods to journalists, which is what I do in my day job, one of the things I discovered was that there is a lot of misunderstanding out there about what technology can and cannot do. So we've gotten into this rhetoric, especially around artificial intelligence, where people say, oh, well, because we have AI now, we can do anything. And it reminds me a lot of the rhetoric in the 90s about the internet. Oh, we have the internet now, and we have the web now, we can do anything. And so I think we need to look to history for a greater understanding of technology and really be honest with ourselves about what technology can and can't do. So there are fundamental limits to what we can do with computers. Computers, ultimately what they do is they compute, right? It's in the name. And they do math. When a computer does something, it's converting the real world into math, which is incredible. It is just a majestic human achievement. But there are things that math can't do, and there are ways that we can't use math to understand the world, and that's okay. But I think we need to inject that understanding, that nuance, into our conversations about technology.
Just to give Tom and Chris something to latch onto, when you say, and I believe you, that there are things that math cannot do, what are the sort of first examples that kind of spring to mind for you?
Love.
Yeah, yeah.
Some people love their computers a lot, though.
People do love their computers. So something else interesting that happens is that we anthropomorphize computers a lot, and we get this kind of fixation on the computing objects that we love. Like people have this kind of cathexis with their phone. The people who feel anxiety when they're separated from their phone. Yeah. And that's a very human phenomenon. I mean, you've got your phone up here, right?
Yeah, right. Well, I've got my notes on my phone.
So I think we just need to look at that and need to say, it's kind of a dumb object.
Tom, let me ask you, I didn't think we'd get here so quickly, but can computers love? I'm just kidding. I was wondering, in the course of your work, if have you kind of developed a theory as to what AI can do really well and what it's actually really crappy at?
Well, to a degree. So we're in the cybersecurity business. That's our entire focus. AI has had great promise for cybersecurity in many ways, improving the ability to predict cyber attacks, creating efficiencies in organizations when they are unable to hire enough cyber experts. These are all good things. That said, it is possible with an AI system in cyber to over-optimize it such that it will, in its attempt to be so efficient, it can also produce many false positives. So it will stop transmissions of communications that it may perceive as being malware, but when in fact they're not. What we've found is we commingle our AI engine with global threat intelligence, which is a different heuristic way of looking at the entire threat landscape, where you try to commingle huge data sets. And then that coupled with an AI engine, and then most importantly, human judgment, that combination tends to produce the best outcomes from a protective point of view. So at the end of the day, I think AI's got great opportunities, but there are also limitations that have to be managed by people who actually have at their best, the moral guidance to make good decisions.
Would you say that, is there a trajectory of improvement over the last 3-4 years as machine learning has really taken hold on precisely the sort of anomaly spotting artificial intelligence that you're talking about. Like, I noticed that my credit card is turned off less frequently when I travel now, partly because I actually call them and tell them I'm going, but it used that not even that would do the trick previously. Do you feel like you guys are getting better at that?
Oh, sure. So much of what we take for granted today in the digital world derives from the benefits of AI. You know, getting faster approvals on transactions. You know, despite the pernicious nature of certain types of social media advertising, you know, it's kind of neat when you're Googling for something and you see options pop up instantaneously. That said, you know, there are costs, there are privacy challenges, there are surveillance possibilities, and these are all things that require a great deal of balancing.
You mentioned privacy issues, and Chris, that happens to be your domain of expertise. Can you tell us, are there ways that AI fundamentally misunderstands the world that are sort of terrible for privacy?
I mean, I always feel bad because AI is a tool. It's going to do some things well. It's going to do some things badly, usually because human beings have, you know, taught it to act that way. I think certainly we've already heard a lot about face recognition, which is a technology powered in large part by AI and machine learning, which certainly can be very invasive. By the same token, we've seen, and similarly, every time we talk about, for example, identifying someone as a potential fraudster, that's often like machine learning making a judgment about a human being. And if you just put those 2-3 words together, you can sort of think, wow, that's a little scary. That's machines judging us and having real world impacts. So certainly, you know, and all of this comes from an abundance of personal information that's out there about all of us already. So in many ways, we've already given up the personal information. It's already driving the AI. Now, we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle, but at minimum, the genie needs to work for us, and we need to regulate it, and we need to figure out the technologies, the ways we're going to use that technology, and the ways that we're not going to let it be used.
And one thing that's interesting to me about this is that most of us, you know, even though we don't apply fancy words like machine learning and artificial intelligence, most of us have sort of entered into a social contract around lending, for instance, where we expect a good amount of our consumer data to be hoovered up by financial institutions, and the credit bureaus, you know, gather all this information and issue a score. Is it qualitatively different that it's machine learning doing that now?
You know, I think that part of if it's a difference, I think it's instructive to know how much regulation there is around lending.
Yeah.
You can't just willy-nilly do whatever you want. If you're a credit bureau or if you're a lender, you've got tremendous number of rules you've got to follow. You've got to let somebody know, for example, why you didn't give them a loan. You've got to explain what happened. And it's exactly those kind of protections that I think we're going to need to build in as we build AI systems. You made a judgment about me, artificial intelligence. I'm going to need to understand why, so I can know if it was a mistake, or if it's something that I can change or improve, like my credit score, how I can do that. And those kind of regulations I think we're missing right now.
How do we work with this tension, like Meredith, as a professor and someone who's sort of interested in the advance of knowledge? I'm sure you two are as well.
She's better at it.
Yeah. I was having a fascinating conversation in New York last week with the Montefiore hospital folks who are doing a kind of unprecedented big data AI system where they bring in just tons and tons of data streams about patients, including, you know, where they live and the health conditions around where they live, and every sensor that attaches to them from the moment they walk into a hospital, from their heart rate or whatever it may be, in order so they can predict, you know, respiratory failure and all these kinds of neat things that we want them to predict, but also a great deal of personal information, and personal information which will likely be of great use to the scholars and medical students of the future. How do you think about that tension in your mind as to how we should be balancing a desire to kind of know everything about everyone and you know, our various serious concerns about privacy?
So I would go to our notion of what it would mean if we could know everything about a person, because there's this underlying fantasy that if we use more and more technology, we will know everything and then we will not need people anymore. Right? So to go back to what Tom was saying earlier, there is a kind of notion that somehow we're going to be able to build enough technology to get rid of people. And that is, it's really strange to me, honestly.
Where do you see that kind of thinking most?
So it's a fantasy that I call techno-chauvinism, the idea that technology is superior to people. And it actually dates back to the very earliest era of our thinking about the digital. So our digital world was really, or our thinking about technology and society was really established by 1960s hippies, who their communes failed, but there was this uncharted world of cyberspace, and they said, oh, well, you know, we are going to build this world of cyberspace that's going to have no government, and it's going to be better. And that just didn't. It wasn't the case. It isn't the case. But along with that, there was this fantasy that computers would replace people. And so really what we need to be thinking about is we need to be thinking about human-in-the-loop systems. We need to stop imagining that it is possible to build some kind of medical diagnostic system that does not involve doctors, right? So the kind of underlying fantasy of let's use AI in medicine, a lot of the time it boils down to let's get rid of doctors, let's get rid of nurses, let's get rid of PAs, let's get rid of all the expensive, complicated human elements so that we can make more money. And that's not actually a world that we want to live in, right? Nobody wants to have a medical experience that is devoid of human beings.
Sure.
So I think we just need to push back at the notion that artificial intelligence is going to be this magnificent force that's going to replace everything. And instead of thinking about autonomous systems that don't involve humans, we need to think about human-in-the-loop systems and how can computers and humans work together to make a better world for humans.
Could you imagine a world where, although humans would not be totally replaced, for instance, you'd want some degree of human touch just in the kind of bedside manner way, like you don't want to hear from HAL 9000 in your oncology appointment, or just like some sort of last ditch, if the computer is recommending a very serious procedure, quadruple bypass, you want to have like a doctor looking over their shoulder, but that might be a drastically reduced medical force, and would that be okay with you?
I think about the times that I go to the doctor and the doctor is on their computer instead of looking at me, or like when the computer is in the corner, at my doctor's office, there's a desktop that sits in the room, and sometimes the doctor actually has to face away from me in order to use the computer, and it's just this very alienating experience.
Yeah.
So when I'm getting medical care, I want to be cared for. I want somebody to look me in the eye and talk to me. And so I think it's great to have diagnostic tools that help doctors. But there's a lot that doctors can do because doctors have cognitive abilities. They have these very sophisticated diagnostic abilities. There's a lot doctors can do that machines can't do. So I think the optimal situation is doctors and machines working together. So think about diagnosis in radiology, for example. Absolutely, yes, we should have AI scans that identify tumors, but we should not imagine that because we have that, we don't need radiologists anymore.
Yeah. Tom, I want to ask you, in thinking about, you mentioned earlier that you're thinking of your team sort of working with a sort of AI plus human teamwork, and just the way Meredith was describing. I'm fascinated. We've all watched the AlphaGo results with a great deal of interest. This is the Go playing AIs that are now just beating world champions with some ease, and that the players, the human players themselves, express this kind of degree of awe over the complexity of their moves and the counterintuitive nature of their moves. How are you finding that on the sort of the cyber attacks that you're looking to thwart? Are the human is maybe in the loop much more in how they're programming it. How is the sort of human cyber attackers versus human plus AI teams on your ends? What's the arms race like there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So here's the big thing to remember. The attackers still have the advantage. I don't care if you're talking about the biggest and best cybersecurity companies in the world, the best startups. even in many cases governments. Hackers, teams of hackers are able to out-innovate defenders currently, given the state of the science, simply because you just have to be right once as an attacker. You have to be right all the time as a defender. That's just a basic element of strategy. The attackers are able to network very quickly. They're not limited by laws and regulations. And in many cases, the economic returns of attacking are huge. You know, for every dollar you invest, you might get a 10K or 100K return, or I should say 100X return. The challenge is we have a huge cyber skills deficit. CSIS did a study about a year ago and projected out about a 1.5 million person deficit in cyber skills across the board. So there's a lot of investment needed in STEM. But AI has the ability to automate functions so that we can move faster, we can respond more in real time, because the hackers are leveraging more and more advanced technology. They too are starting to leverage AI, and it's just this terrible arms race. So we have to automate, we have to use larger data sets, but here's the key point. We always have to keep humans in the loop to make the right decisions, because if you get a fully automated AI-powered cyber event that starts to spin out of control, you know, machines really don't have the wisdom to make the right calls. So we have to be extremely careful in the way in which we deploy AI.
And given that the asymmetric nature of this sort of conflict, is it possible that the other side, the cyber attacking side, will be more cavalier in not wanting to keep a human in the loop and actually be delighted if there's some sort of
Absolutely,
effect?
potentially. That is one of the that is one of the truly scary scenarios we need to plan for. And I think, you know, from an ethics point of view, it is balancing the upside and the downside from new technology innovations in such a way that we can produce optimal social outcomes. That's really the obligation from an ethics point of view.
I want to go to some audience questions in a minute, but first, Chris, I want to ask you, you mentioned earlier, you made the excellent point that, as a retort to my credit bureau example, that there's quite a bit of regulation around privacy in the lending industry as it's currently constituted. We've seen a kind of cultural shift over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years, where in the late aughts, tech had a great deal of cultural power and prestige that maybe under one theory insulated them from sort of political consequences, even from kind of privacy transgressions that were starting to become apparent at the time. That has certainly shifted. People like Mark Zuckerberg or whoever else are kind of not regarded as out-and-out villains, but at least the public has much more of a skeptical eye about them. And from your perspective, has that helped juice along the process to arrive at new norms and, forget norms, actual regulations around privacy?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I think it's a little bit of this is a cultural moment that's not just about one thing, right? I mean, certainly the technology is impacting more people's lives, and that means it's having more negative impacts as well, and that's just a reality. I think we're seeing sort of a general feeling that there's a substantial inequality in the United States, and tech is part of the problem there, and that's another factor. We're also seeing that, whether it's the state of California or Europe, are saying we have different cultural values around privacy, and we're going to pass legislation, and that's another thing that's pushing us along. So I would say, and honestly, I would say the election of President Trump, a lot of people felt like that was if not tech's fault, certainly it played a significant role, and that underscored to a lot of people the seriousness of these questions. So all those things, you put them together, and you have a pretty substantial current towards more regulation. I think what it'll look like, I think, is very much still up in the air, but I think we're going to see something, and we're going to see it in a near-term horizon, 1 to 3 year horizon.
Do you ever worry? I mean, a colleague of mine, he and I were in Slack going back and forth about the headline for a piece about precisely this question, and we sort of co-coined this phrase, privacy nihilism. And we worry because, we used to see whenever there was a big data breach at one of the large companies, it was like, oh, we really have to cover this, what a
Right.
big news event. However, hundreds of millions of people's personal data has been exposed. And to be honest, we feel, I'm embarrassed to say, less and less pressure to do that because the public kind of shrugs their shoulder. Everyone sort of has this baseline assumption that all my personal data is on the dark web anyway. How do you kind of fight that, a certain fatigue around these issues?
Sure. I mean, I guess what I would say is sort of data breaches are one very narrow category of thing that privacy people worry about. And it's ironically, the data breach laws essentially were passed in order to raise awareness with the assumption that it would lead to sort of regulation more broadly. And instead, we sort of stopped at data breach for about 10 years. But now this conversation that we're having is a privacy conversation. It's all about how we're using data in society. When we talk about how Facebook moderates content and how it combats hate speech, that's a privacy conversation. So I think, in fact, we're having more of these conversations. They're having more regulatory touches. So certainly I could see us in a place where we don't feel like we have robust regulation. I think that's certainly a real and legitimate possibility. But I think we are broadening the conversation in a more realistic way about how technology is impacting our lives.
And I think something interesting about the fact that the conversation is about privacy
Right.
is that it's really expanded now, where when we're talking about privacy, we're also talking about inequality. Because privacy is not applied equally across the socioeconomic spectrum.
Sure.
People who have less money, who have less access to resources, are increasingly being judged by automated systems, whereas rich people are judged by humans. And it's a lot easier to get through the system when you're being judged by humans as opposed to by these automated systems, because everybody kind of throws up their hands and says, oh, well, the computer says this.
Virginia Eubanks is a great scholar, famously said, if you want to see the future of surveillance, look at where poor people are right now. Look at how food stamps are handled. I mean, you're seeing neighborhoods. There are many more surveillance cameras, for example, in poorer communities. You don't. The future is now. It's just not evenly distributed. That's another famous science fiction quote. But you're seeing a lot more surveillance amongst the poor than you are amongst affluent people who can afford to pay their way out of it.
I want to take this time to go to an audience question or two. We got right here in the front.
Hi.
There's microphone.
Sidney Friedberg,
Oh,
Hi. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense, and former National Journal Group person, actually. I come from the defense world where what you use AI for is a little different and gets ethically naughty with a K, but other way too, perhaps. So I'm curious from a privacy standpoint, from a cybersecurity standpoint, from a broader ethical standpoint. We've seen companies refuse to work on DoD contracts for fears of privacy or automation being used for lethal force, though DoD policy says all the things about keeping the human in the loop that you guys have said. But is there an ethical obligation for companies and individuals to not work on defense projects or espionage projects so they could violate privacy or end up with so-called killer robots? Is there an ethical obligation to work on them because even if you're a tech person, you're not a citizen of the world, a citizen of a country, or somewhere in between?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, we view AI as a tool, and it's a tool that you can use well, and it's a tool you can use badly. I think that given this relatively experimental nature of AI, I would be deeply troubled if it, as we've already made the point several times, became sort of like the frontline decision-making tool in a system that was a life and death situation. So I think that's something that's appropriately aligned, but I don't think we're going to be able to sort of keep AI out of the defense, sector. I think that ship has already long sailed.
We've got.
Yes, hi. Good morning. Up here?
Nope.
Back
there we are.
Hi there, Antonio Orsi, focused on health policy issues. Maybe circling back on this conversation of building ethically, and as we think around health, what are certain guardrails we might want to consider? Currently we're having these challenges of access to health outcomes focus. And AI, I find to be a great opportunity to really tackle a lot of these issues, whether it be telemedicine, whether it be direct in-home care, et cetera. When you think about building ethically, what are certain guardrails you would want to take into consideration?
So when I think about guardrails, I think about common sense. So for a very long time, we've been involved in this techno-chauvinist rhetoric that, oh, we just need to put technology into everything. And we kind of stop there. So I think we need to get beyond the idea that we need more technology everywhere, because the digital revolution is over, right? Like tech is mundane now. And we need to couple a deeper understanding of technology with greater common sense. Because the first finding that we find with AI or with data science or with big data, the first things that people find when they go into a new field is they find the things that people already know, right? So like when you use AI to analyze health outcomes, guess what? Poor people have worse health outcomes than rich people. Like that's the finding that you get. So we don't really need incredibly complicated, sophisticated, expensive AI tools to know that. Like we've already done that analysis, and we know it from social science, and we know it from history. So these are things we already know. So we need to get beyond the easy questions and think, can AI really help us make things better? Because how do you solve the problem of homelessness? Well, you don't solve homelessness with an app. You solve homelessness by giving people homes, right? So technology is not always the answer. And so we need to, as Alondra Nelson said recently, we need to open up a space to say no to technology. We need to say, all right, is technology the right tool for the task? If so, which technology? Is it AI? Is it something less sexy than AI, but equally useful? And we need to sometimes say no when we're getting out over our own skis, like when we're opening up new threat surfaces by implementing technology in a way that that creates opportunities for security breaches. Sometimes paper is really useful.
Tom, Meredith, Chris, thanks for being with us this morning. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Artificial intelligence isn't coming, it's here. It's the defining technology of our time. But it's human ingenuity that makes it so powerful. Jane started losing her vision when she was 12.
California Street.
She uses Seeing AI,
I crept down the stairs.
Crept down the stairs and out the door,
which enables her to read and navigate her world. Microsoft AI is helping farmers adapt to climate change.
We can use technology to help feed the world without wrecking the planet.
Enabling wildlife conservation.
The ability to use AI really democratizes science. WildMe uses images from any source to help study endangered species.
And creating new ways for people with hearing loss to communicate.
I want the exact same information that my hearing friends have.
It's more than just imitating intelligence or sounding like a human. Microsoft AI is changing every industry, from healthcare.
And now you can see these finite details, the relationship with many structures.
To engineering. And telecommunications.
We are using artificial intelligence to change the way we are relating to customers.
AI lets us put people first.
The Microsoft tools really enabled us to breathe digital life into an iconic brand persona.
The product that we make is not a thing in a box.
No.
Microsoft AI empowers others to create experiences and potential. This is just the beginning.
Artificial intelligence, it's just opened up this whole world.
The future we invent is a choice we make.
Now, a conversation brought to you by our underwriter, Microsoft. Please welcome Thomas Kaczynski, Vice President of Information Technology for DC Water, and Tony Towns Whiteley, President of U.S. Regulated Industries for Microsoft.
Hey, right up here.
Morning.
Hey, good morning.
My day job is regulated industries for Microsoft in the United States, which includes financial services, healthcare, government, and education. As well, I sit on the AI Ethics Committee for Microsoft. So this conversation around regulation, the role of government, the role of technology, and the conversation around ethics is part of a very deep and daily conversation we're having at Microsoft. Today, I get the opportunity to introduce Tom Kaczynski, who's here with DC Water. And we're going to kind of shift the conversation a bit to talk about the practical, pragmatic applications of AI and other technologies that are being used and where and how it makes sense. Tom is Vice President of IT at DC Water. You've had over 35 years of experience in IT, obviously joining the industry right out of middle school. And look, joining DC Water in 2013. So I thought we'd start off with the conversation about DC Water itself, the scale, your interesting clientele. Talk to us a little bit about DC Water, explain that to the audience, as well as what are some of the challenges that the technology that we'll speak to are helping you address.
Be happy to do that, Tony, and thanks for having me today.
Yeah.
For folks that don't know, DC Water operates the largest advanced wastewater treatment plant in the world. Our Blue Plains facility processes about 200 to 300 million gallons of wastewater a day. We manage 1,900 miles of sewer system, some of which is over 100 years old, and we distribute 99 million gallons of water a day through 1,300 miles of distribution pipe. We're also actually installing, in the middle of a $2.7 billion project, stormwater management project, which is designed to reduce the overflows in the Anacostia and Potomac rivers by about 98%. So we've got a big operation, and we actually serve some of the most powerful and most important people in the world, if not just the country. So we've got a lot going on at DC Water. Probably the largest challenge is actually the cost to manage and operate and support that system on a long-term basis. And technology, we believe, is an avenue to help us better manage that process, improve customer service, increase reliability, but also reduce the cost of the operation as well.
So we've talked about cost and customer service, as well as you've given some of the metrics around the scale of the operation you run and the clientele that you serve, from the White House to other parts of the Washington, D.C. area. Let's talk about specifically how you've infused technology in specific parts of your operation, and what are some of the outcomes, benefits, as well as, quite frankly, maybe even some of the unintended or unknown benefits that were part of that operation.
So since about 2014, when I joined, after I joined DC Water, we developed a technology strategy, digitization strategy for the utility, where we would move a lot of our operations away from paper-based solutions to digital platforms. That includes mobile work management, that includes customer self-service portals, but it also includes a strategy around cloud first, which is to move our entire portfolio of applications off-premise into the cloud, as well as a buy and adopt strategy, essentially buying what we can and adopting the functionality that's available in that application as quickly as possible. And the primary driving force around that was actually to continue to maintain our systems at the most current level possible. And it also gives us the ability to take advantage of newer technologies more quickly than we could have in the past with an on-premise solution that we had to manage.
And look, we talk about how you've done it. In the how is a sequencing of beginning with IoT or Internet of Things, and how you've used those kinds of sensors and those sort of data collection devices up front, as well as not quite a big bang is what I hear, is a very sort of a rolling implementation. Can you talk a little bit about the how?
It's actually been a very deliberate strategy, starting with when I joined the organization, most of the systems were 4+ years old, hadn't been maintained. That includes both the hardware and the software. So we needed to make investments across the entire portfolio of IT. But we couldn't do it all at once, and for two reasons. Number one, it was expensive. Number two, it's more risky than a more deliberate approach. So we established a strategy. We looked at our highest risk solutions first, and then we started to replace those. But at the same time, we needed to position ourselves for the future. You mentioned the IoT devices and taking advantage of those. So we actually followed two paths. One was to replace our core systems, our customer billing systems, financial, HR, and the like, but also a second path that was more strategically focused. And that particular path actually was more targeted towards individual pilots that then ultimately grew into a comprehensive solution set for the organization.
So I'm going to go off script. You've got a couple of predictive capabilities that you've put in place. Your top two favorites here in terms of the solutions and what they're driving in your current operation.
So the favorite right now is our Pipe Sleuth solution, which is actually using the Microsoft Cognitive Toolkit to detect and classify pipe defects. So what we've essentially done is replaced what traditionally was a highly manual process, labor-intensive plus costly process for inspecting our sewer system to identify potential defects in the system and then determine repair and replacement schedules. We've actually replaced that with a deep learning neural network application that analyzes the video stream rather than having an operator look at that. It actually detects, classifies, and scores all the pipe defects in about 10% of the time it would take a traditional operator to do that, and at a cost reduction of about 50 to 75%. So we've taken the cost of a linear foot of pipe inspection down from $7 to $8 a linear foot down to $2 or $3 a linear foot. So there's a substantial improvement in the detection capabilities, but also a significant reduction in the cost. So we're able to drive those benefits back to the organization. The second one's not so predictive, but it's our smart water fountain. We designed and built the first IoT-enabled water fountain that actually detects, monitors water quality at the point of use. And we're in the process of installing 113 of those in Flint, Michigan right now.
Smart water fountain, if everybody didn't catch that. I love that right there. Now, we talked about Flint. What's happening here? Do we have smart water fountains here in D.C.?
We've got 8 installed. We've had two at Octo headquarters, and we've had 4 at our facility, and then we've had 2 of them on our test bench for about 3.5 years now.
Okay, phenomenal. Look, we're always going around the U.S. speaking to various city leaders, municipal leaders, folks directly in your industry in water and electric. And there's a conversation about the value, the utility, the cost savings, some of the myth, if you will, and magic around the technology. Advice that you would offer. You've been doing this for over 3 decades. You've been doing it with DC Water for a number of years. What's the sort of top 2 or 3 nuggets that you offer?
Yeah, I think you got to start out realizing that there's always going to be a bit of skepticism, especially with newer technologies and more advanced technologies like AI. There's going to be a bit of fear and concern from the workforce about whether or not they're going to be somehow displaced by these technologies. And I think the third thing is really it's sometimes hard for people to understand the cost benefit of these particular investments, especially on some of the more predictive things like main break predictions, predictive models. Our Pipe Sleuth solution was fairly straightforward. We were able to prove the benefits up front after a small prototype that we did. So that was pretty easy, but the predictive models are a little bit more difficult, and getting people to invest in those is a little bit more challenging. So I'd say, the first thing is find those opportunities that are the biggest pain points for the organization, but also some of the higher cost activities in the organization, and focus on those first. Drive those benefits, and then with that, you can drive greater adoption throughout the organization for other more creative solutions.
So find the pain points, the largest ones, prioritize those, go after those first, and be aware of some of the concerns, right? The hype curve around new tech, the concern of job and job displacement, and the cost-benefit analysis are the 3 that I hear. Look, I mean, we're at Microsoft, if I can just pull it back for a minute in terms of this particular conversation, we are particularly proud to have you and organizations like DC Water using the technology. But the conversation all day, which you've heard for the last hour or so, is the broader conversation that's occurring across Microsoft. It's a conversation about the the use of the technology, the efficacy of the technology, the ethics around the technology, how and where and when, and what are the appropriate uses of the technology. That's why we launched an AI business school. AI business school online, free for all business leaders to understand how do we make decisions as business leaders? Where should tech be involved and infused? Where should you make decisions around sensitive uses where you may take it to a very different decision matrix? So I want to make sure that you're aware for today. In the back of the room, there's a booth there that speaks to AI for business leaders and the site and how you can get that information as well. I believe over the next week or so, we'll launch it specifically for government leaders. So there'll be specific case studies and criteria there. The Seeing AI that you saw in the video that is used by many individuals, not only with sight-impaired individuals, but low-sight individuals, that also is on display in the back. So let's make sure we're all aware of where AI can and should play a role, and that's what we're here for. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us for this. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Next, a look at artificial intelligence in healthcare. Please welcome Dawn Rucker, National Coordinator for Health IT for the Department of Health and Human Services. Leading the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Olga Kazan.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about the use of technology in a field that's not often associated with being at the forefront of technology. I know you're trying to change that. But so let's start out with kind of a look at the problem. You know, we all know anytime you have to deal with anything related to the doctor's office, you know, we were talking backstage, you're looking at, 45 minutes on the phone, you're looking at a lot of faxes in some cases, it's a little behind the times. Kind of lay out, why is healthcare kind of a little bit retrograde when it comes to technology?
Yeah. So I think the reason healthcare sort of lags is really fundamentally because of the way we pay for it. So healthcare is not really in a consumer market economy, right? We have, for a variety of reasons, actually dating back to World War II, and how health insurance is a pre-tax benefit, put a lot of third parties in, and they don't really have our consumer interests, frankly, first and foremost. That's sort of understandable. They have a mix of their interests, some version of our interests, so it sort of keeps us out of just the main consumer economy.
I see.
But we're trying to change that.
Right. Okay, so I want to talk about the two major rules that came out that are trying to get at that. So can you kind of describe the two rules that are out right now?
Sure. So under 21st Century Cures, December 2016, passed almost unanimously, 390 votes plus in the House, 90 in the Senate, signed by President Obama. It's something that President Trump and the White House are very, very strongly in favor of, is getting consumers back in the game, getting consumer choice in. And what does that mean today? Obviously, at a session like this, it really means getting the medical record, your chart, onto your smartphone. That's the computer we have. Mm-hmm. And so within Health and Human Services, there are two rules that are actually out for public comment until June 3rd. If you go to healthit.gov, you can see the Office of National Coordinator. So we're the agency that coordinates healthcare IT, electronic medical records, if you will, then with CMS that pays for Medicare, Medicaid, those programs. And so we have two rules to get the American public back into computational control of their data as a start to actually really being able to shop. So in the O&C rule, we are requiring of electronic health records, so of providers, doctors, and hospitals, that there's an application programming interface with then secure technology, OAuth 2, for those who know that, to allow you to direct your smartphone at your provider's EMR and download your data. We're starting with some structured data first, but eventually it will be all the data. CMS has a companion rule to require the payers to download your claims data. Mm-hmm. So they're already doing that with something called Blue Button 2.0 for Medicare fee-for-service, but are going to extend that to Medicare Advantage, Medicaid. So the entirety of it is you control the data, and then once you control it, with apps of your choosing, not of the provider's choosing, of your choosing, then I think the things we're talking about here, like artificial intelligence, really can come in a consumer economy, because it's going to be your choice of app that is going to drive the services.
So you can actually look at your phone and say, oh yeah, my vitamin
Yep.
D levels are low,
Yep.
as opposed to now you have to call your doctor and say, what?
Yep, yeah, or log on. With some prior rulemaking, there are portals, but the more people you go to, the more portals, the more passwords.
Yeah.
And I think we know that experience. It's not consumer friendly.
And the purpose of the insurance companies having the claims data downloaded, what will that help?
Well, there's an interesting thing. So there are two people who actually need data. So the claims data, the advantage to the public is, you can see what's, a little bit more transparently what's happening. And then I'm guessing folks are going to aggregate that into shopping apps and sort of, a better version of starting on the road to price transparency. There's other policy things going on in the works there, but that's still a work in progress. Interestingly enough, to this theme here, the payers who buy healthcare on our behalf actually aren't able to download the electronic records either.
Oh.
Right? So if you're a large American health payer and you're trying to figure out, should I use this network or that network? Should I, contract with Georgetown or GW or MedStar or Hopkins? And where can I get the best deal on behalf of us as consumers? Believe it or not, they don't actually have access to the electronic data either. So part of what we're doing at ONC is working with large payers to do a modern RESTful JSON with a healthcare add-on called FireFast Healthcare Interoperability, so that they can get the data on our behalf. That doesn't exist yet. It is just coming out.
Wow, okay.
So,
and we've heard a little bit of this before with something called meaningful use. Now, this was several years ago. I remember writing a story where I interviewed a bunch of doctors. I said, what do you think about the new electronic health records rule? And they said, I'm keeping my paper charts. I'm not using the computer. And they were very grumpy about it. So how did that go, and what's going on with meaningful use right now?
So meaningful use is largely, there was a program that came out of the high-tech stimulus. And this was, think 2009, and this was an effort to basically gin up the economy. And so then the rules were really about the fiduciary responsibility on the $30 billion that went into EHRs. I think it is pretty commonly acknowledged by everybody that didn't fully work out the way it was hoped, and that would be an understatement. And I think was actually largely, there are still vestiges of this just because of various laws that remain, but I think most of that is really, was actually withdrawn pretty much by the prior administration, who also started it.
And so now, and I think you mentioned something like you're trying to get it to be more focused on freeing the data to the patients as opposed to having the provider have all the data.
Yes. There are, in the Cures Act, there's actually prohibitions against information blocking, right? Because often a lot of if you look around the American landscape throughout the country, the business model often for healthcare providers is buy every competitor hospital and then stick it to the payers on your pricing. That's not a technical term, but if you're wondering why healthcare costs are going up, that is the business model. So I'm not going to iterate through the cities in America where you can see that, but there are quite a few of them. DC is a relatively competitive market, so this is not one where you would really look at that. And so much higher prices, and in that business model, you want to prevent something called leakage, right? Patients going elsewhere. So there's a natural tendency to want to keep that information a little bit close to the vest. Under the Cures Act, those type of behaviors are actually now illegal.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn to audience questions in just a little bit, so be thinking of your questions. But first, I want to ask you about something it's just so I think, important to a lot of patients, which is price transparency and even like network transparency.
Right.
I spent a lot of time the other day trying to figure out if an anesthesiologist was going to be in network for me, and it was probably at least 10 phone calls and more than 3 hours of time. And it just seems that's like a lot of wasted, inefficiency. So is that anywhere on the horizon to
Yeah,
have
I mean, that is
more clear?
exactly what we're trying to do. I mean,
Yeah.
right, this is everybody who's had an experience. I mean, if you just want a routine visit, I mean, I had to do something and it took me 20 minutes to make a follow-up appointment.
Yeah.
I mean, so we think, application programming interfaces, modern computing has solved this in every other industry. So we're really trying to open that up in healthcare to get these new business models. Price transparency, because of the historic complexity, is a complicated issue. We're starting with transparency in the chart just to actually get your data so you can shop, right? So you can say if you don't like that provider, you have your data and you can go elsewhere. But I think part of that is price transparency. We are looking within the administration at what we can do there. As folks know, we have to look what we can do in the executive branch because we're probably not going to get any healthcare reform from the legislative branch, though there's a lot of interest in surprise billing, what you're describing. So, there will probably be some things, hopefully, jointly there, but we just need transparency everywhere in the system and having applications programming interfaces to have that transparency be computational. It's not enough that you write a rule that says if you call and spend 3 hours on the phone, you might get the information, right? That's totally unmodern.
Right.
What we need is that you can get it on your phone right away.
Right.
So that's what we're working on.
That would be ideal. I want to see if anyone has questions, and we should have mic runners coming to you.
Hi, my name is Halla Flynn. I work in higher education and I'm a master's student at Syracuse University. I had a question about the implications of informed consent in the medical field. So traditionally, clinicians have an obligation to make sure they have informed consent from a patient before they provide treatment. How does technology play into whether you can identify if a patient has felt informed before they give their consent, whether that's using a patient portal, collecting their information, or using telemedicine?
Yeah, on one level, informed consent is easier because you have a log file, right? I mean, it's very hard to fake up a log file. I suppose it can be done. But so on one level, the documentation is almost self-documenting. I think what your question is getting at is maybe that richer issue that I know was covered earlier this morning on how do we really inform people on secondary uses of data? Now, in healthcare, specifically, all of that is actually illegal, right? So under the HIPAA Act of 1996, health insurance portability is what it was originally about. It turns out that what providers and their business partners can do is tightly prescribed to very specific things around treatment payment operations. So in healthcare today, that is illegal. When you, under what we've just talked about, download the data onto your smartphone, you, under your HIPAA right of access, that is, then anything that happens downstream is your responsibility, right? It is at that point, it is your data, it is your responsibility. And then we're in the question of how do we, how do we talk about secondary use of data? What are the consent things? This will probably, I think, end up in Congress, if for no other reason than with Europe, the GDPR, some of the California rules, a variety of other state rules. It is really in play. And initially, of course, you have to realize your health data is permanent, right? So you want to be very careful in what apps you use to download it. And we're going to see, I think there'll be branding there. I think we're going to, the same way we just wouldn't go to somebody on a corner and use a person in a cart for our banking, right? I mean, we're going to use a name brand that we've heard of and the bricks and mortar somewhere, maybe not on your smartphone, but somewhere. So we think that there's going to be branding and, again, the type of consumer market that's been missing in the rest of healthcare. Branding is part of that. Ethics and trust are part of that. So we think that will actually come in as this.
Right. Yeah. Anyone else? Oh.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Leif Brierly with Johnson & Johnson, and I was just wondering if you could speak to ONC's perspective on connected medical devices and the interaction with health systems and health information systems.
Yeah, so obviously the world of Internet of Things, right, is upon us, and this is is just starting. Everybody's heard of, the Apple Watch and the EKG and the glucometers and the digital scales. I think there's going to be a lot more there. It is one of the great opportunities to materially lower the cost of healthcare using AI as a surround. Healthcare, certainly inpatient healthcare, is incredibly labor intensive. If you've ever been on a med-surg nursing unit, the amount of energy that's spent in fairly ill-defined activities, and part of that is really instrumenting things. Part of having crisp, modern APIs, which we haven't historically had in healthcare, is to allow that to happen in a reasonable kind of way. So that is what a lot of this work is about. Again, we're using the RESTful JSON and FHIR stack to do that. That's RESTful and JSON is what those that sort of data movement and formulation standard is what powers most apps on cell phones today.
I can't actually see the audience, so flag down a mic person if you have questions. Okay, well, I have a question, which is, so as we talk about, Internet of Things and getting your data, and I put in my number of steps or whatever, it tracks me when I run. What's the balance between, oh, it's great, I've closed all my rings today, and not having that sold to someone? Should we be worried about data privacy? Is that not really a concern, or what's being done about that?
Yeah, I think you absolutely have to be worried about it. Now, I think on some level, we've made an implicit deal that much of our data is going to be shared, right? If you have a smartphone on you, which I'm guessing in this audience is right at 100%, right? We have essentially made a little bit of a lot of a deal, right? Every time you do a Google search, every time you fiddle with Facebook, all of that information is there. I think people, again, probably the best way to solve that is with branding and consumer trust. That is the way we do it, and consumer trust is hard to get. We don't buy food that doesn't have a label on it, right? There's no unlabeled food. Every piece of food pretty much that has manufacturing to it in your grocery store has either a general brand or a specific house brand. So we have a lot of experience with safety around branding. I think that will happen. I think people will get good at tracking things. I think we still as a country have to do a lot of work on informed consent. And this is much broader, as you point out, Olga, than just your medical record, right? If your accelerometer says you're just sitting around all day, right, that is a lot of health information about you, right? That would allow me to write an insurance contract against your life or your health insurance at probably a twofold difference.
Right.
Just based on that piece of information alone, and being smart about those patterns. So I think we have to look at the totality of that, and it is a world that is evolving.
Right. Is that already happening? Because there's John Hancock, right, is doing I thought they were doing the insurance plans where they can you get a discount if you're more active, or if you
I've seen that. I don't know who's doing it. I saw one that I think if you can do an 8-minute mile, you get a certain rate. I guess I'm not up for that one
right
anymore.
Taking advantage of that deal. Well, thank you so much, Don Rucker. Thanks for being here.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Now for a conversation on predicting the future of AI for Homeland Security. Please welcome John Boyd, Assistant Director of Futures Identity, Office of Biometric Identity Management in the Department of Homeland Security. To lead the conversation, welcome back, Jean Meserve.
Thanks so much for joining us. First, what a title. Assistant Director, Futures Identity, Office of Biometric Identity Management. What is it? What do you do?
Well, thank you very much for being here. And I did want to say that these views are my personal views, don't represent the official views of the Department of Homeland Security. It's really an awesome opportunity to work within Department of Homeland Security to look at some of those longer range capabilities as we explore new modalities, new variants on current biometric modalities that we get from the components, and provide analytical services back to components like Customs and Border Patrol, ICE, and CIS.
Obviously, you see this as a great tool for the department.
Right.
Talk to us a bit about how it's being used now. Which component agencies are employing AI?
We support about 45 customers, both across DHS, the interagency, and internationally. AI is being used largely and to train some of the matchers to gain better accuracy for both face and, to an extent, fingerprints and iris. Those are the three main modalities that we're collecting right now.
Train the matchers, so you're talking about training people to do this better, or training machines?
It's training machines, but I would reference the second machine age, Brynjolfsson and McAfee, where they talk about this in the second machine age, we need to be focusing on the things that we still are going to depend on people to do for cognitive things like complex pattern matching, which is fundamentally what we're doing when we're matching biometrics. The machines will be handling a lot of other things, a lot of other activities, and what they talk about is human-machine teaming. So you get a lot more out of you're running with the machines, not against the machines, not instead of the machines. And we do that now to an extent with our fingerprint matching. We have automated matchers, and then there are times if it's close but we're not sure, it'll go to a what's called a 10-print examiner, and then they're taking that output from the machine and doing a visual analysis to come up with a match, no match.
So it's giving you speed, it's giving you better accuracy.
Better accuracy.
Okay. So which component agencies are using it? I would guess CBP, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Transportation Security Administration.
Right.
Others?
Others across the department, Citizenship, Immigration Services are again all using our services for both matching, and sometimes it's a one-to-many match for identification, and then sometimes it's a one-to-one verification.
Who are they trying to identify? For what purpose?
Great question. And I would submit that it's not so much about, people see me coming and here's the biometrics guy. We need to be thinking about biometrics as it relates to an application. The value is in the ability to identify people. And identification is broader than just a biometric match. So think of identity as that collection of attributes about a person to make a decision about that person. Now, again, we're in DHS, so in some cases, we pick up somebody coming across the border illegally. Are they on a watch list? Are they a terrorist? These are people that are trying everything they can to maintain their anonymity. And we have to strip them of the anonymity to find out, are they a threat or not? So that is, I call that, from the standpoint of the subject, identity is a liability. My identity is a liability to me because when that's stripped away, they'll find out I'm a bad actor. Now, compare that with a total different set of users in our department. Identity is an asset. I'm looking for a benefit. It's me, it's John Boyd, I'm getting on a plane. It's me, John Boyd, coming into the building over in Roslyn where I work. It's John Boyd when I go onto a network. Trust me, it's John Boyd. And so the policies and the controls around that are different for people whom we're trying to provide a benefit and verify it's who they claim to be versus trying to screen bad actors.
So for those who are getting a benefit out of this, do they always know that you're collecting this biometric information?
I'll say that we follow the DHS fair information practices. And so with we have an entire team at OBIM, Office of Biometric Identity Management, that handles all of those privacy civil rights, civil liberties, and other legal issues, such that we implement those policies and the sharing restrictions and collections that are follow the law and follow the privacy practices.
Is there any way you can quantify for us how much information is being taken in and how long it's held and who it's shared with?
Okay, first let me begin with share it with, because that's a concern for a lot of people. Again, the data that we're storing, we don't own. We are merely, one word is curating it for CBP or ICE or CIS or an international organization.
Do they own it, however?
They own it. We are storing it for them. For example, State Department. State Department doesn't have its own biometric database. So anybody coming into the country, when they present with a passport, fingerprint, face, we are storing that data. And it's all lined out in service level agreements so that only the people, after it's all been through review, can see that information, and other groups specifically can't see that information. So there's that piece. Just some of the numbers. We are, today, we will probably hit close to 400,000 biometric transactions today. That's face, finger, and iris for both verification and identification. Worldwide, because again, State Department, there's international partners, a lot going on at the southern border, but really all over the country. And the thing of it is, with our system, for every biometric match, there's other identity services called out. Oh, John Boyd provided fingerprints, there's a match. Do we know anything else about John Boyd? Let's check these watch lists. Oh, John Boyd's on a watch list. What tier terrorist is he? Things along those lines. And so for every biometric transaction, there's about 2 identity services that are called out. So we're processing about 1.5 million, upwards of 1.5 million things a day.
And how many bad guys are you catching in a day?
It's at minimum dozens.
At a minimum?
At a minimum, right, on any given day.
And on a scale of bad guys, are these minor infractions, or are we talking about?
Well, it ranges from straight criminals to international terrorists, high tier levels. Yes, we do get those matches.
Getting back to the sharing aspect of this for just a minute, you've talked a bit about what's happening within the department. What about, for instance, with local law enforcement agencies?
We are providing services to groups like Texas for latent fingerprint, so that's an expanding service that we are providing.
End?
Well, if we have latent fingerprints stored in our database, and certain local authorities or state may not have direct access to that. So it's a lengthy process to work out all of the sharing agreements with the states to make sure that it's all, again, legal, statutory, privacy, civil rights, civil liberties are all observed.
So a lot of people have questions about whether those things are being observed, including people who work for some of the tech companies who have been saying to their bosses, wait a minute, on government contracts. Have you run into a bind there? Have there been instances where you have wanted to buy a technology where a company has not been willing to sell it to you?
No. Quite frankly, again, what we are in production on is face, finger, and iris, and that's been in production for a number of years now. What I'm exploring, not in production, but exploring DNA, for example, and there hasn't been a pushback on that yet.
Do you anticipate there will be?
Well, we've worked through some of the statutory questions, but we haven't addressed a lot of the privacy. That's going to take a while. But again, the value of just saying DNA, it lies in the application. People that are coming across the border, and if you watch the news this morning, some of these are breaking. Pilots are already in place with ICE and CBP. You've got families asserting, these are my biological children. You can run DNA analysis, not next generation phenotyping and all that, but just a straight short tandem repeat, and determine, is the claim justified? Is it correct or not? And from a few weeks ago, the reports that we're getting is that it could be upwards of a third of the claimed family members were not their family members. So they're committing fraud. We can use DNA for that. Again, not being used in production. It's very tightly controlled. A lot of the data is being deleted after the analyses are run. But that's part of the exploration as we look to do that. Another one, we're looking to explore voice, and it's as much for call centers. Again, we haven't even started this, but we're about to. And we've got some organizations in DHS that will run a call center with 50,000 calls a day. And with consent of those that are calling in, it's possible, that's what we expect to find out, to have people call in and assert, it's me, John Boyd, okay, verify it's John Boyd, and then shift over to changing an address or a phone number, things along those lines.
I would think that on the vocal side of things, that's something that could be easily manipulated, unlike a DNA sample. Am I incorrect?
Anything can be manipulated. I mean, if you go to the right country, synthetic DNA can be generated. That's being done. Would it be easier to manipulate a voice? Which is why we work very closely with our components or anybody using this to make sure that when they collect, it's tightly controlled collection so that we aren't being spoofed. Presentation attacks are a concern for us.
How long do you keep the data? Is it a matter of days, or okay, you're storing it for the other agents?
Right. It's on the order of decades.
Decades.
Yes.
So to Joe Citizen, that can sound a little terrifying. You're collecting all this biometric information about me, and you're going to hold it for decades, potentially for the rest of my life? Should I be scared?
I would submit that you do not need to be afraid.
Do you believe him?
I say I'm from the government. I'm here to help. I would submit. I go back to the very tight controls we've got from headquarters, our own privacy staff, our own general counsel on staff, to make sure that when we're collecting, we're collecting it for a certain use. We minimize the sharing. We minimize just what we collect, but a lot of the folks that we've collected on are watch listed people. They're bad actors, and the idea being we may pick them up trying to get a visa coming into the country over in the Middle East, and the next thing you know, they're coming across the southern border. There's the value in that.
Is there a fear that we become a surveillance state? I mean, you don't have that fear, but other people certainly have articulated that. Is it a valid concern, given how much data you hold?
I would submit it's not a great concern. I know
not a great concern.
It's still a conversation that we will continue to have as we work with public affairs, have events like this. But again, we are tightly controlled on what we can collect. We're collecting for specific purposes, for specific lengths of time, and matching and sharing that only under tightly controlled circumstances.
It sounds to me like potentially a treasure trove for hackers. Could they get to it?
I will state that we are following very tight cybersecurity controls in all the systems that we have, and we have people that do penetration testing to try and figure out if they can get in. We're looking at the threats, and we are following the latest and greatest measures to ensure that doesn't happen.
But there's no such thing as absolute security, correct?
That's true. That's true.
Do you have confidence that all of these technologies actually work? So I used to cover the Department of Homeland Security, and I remember how much money was spent on cameras and sensors to be deployed to the southern border to detect people coming across between ports of entry. And it turned out that once you put it out there in the desert, in the heat, in the sand, in bad weather, it didn't work so well. Are you confident that all these technologies will work in the real world setting where they're being deployed?
We're getting that now. Now, you'll have systems that break, or if things aren't cleaned, and you have to get back to the operator to say, clean off the cover for the fingerprint reader. But the bottom line is the science is sound, particularly for fingerprints. And as we look to DNA for STR, that's been mature since the 80s, and we're basically leveraging what other parts of the government are already doing. And the other thing around that is, and it does come back to accuracy, because you don't want mismatches, and you don't want to mismatch to the wrong person. And that's why
racial bias was discussed in one of the earlier.
True. So it's a matter of using more data to drive those accuracy rates up into the high 90s, so above 99%, so we can better trust the results.
What are the accuracy rates right now?
It's in the for fingerprints, it's in the 98, 99 or higher realm.
In some of the others.
And face is not as mature as fingerprints. Iris.
Can you give us a number?
It depends on how well you tune the system. And this is where, from the recent NIST reports, we're finding that there's been great increases in accuracy by using artificial intelligence, machine learning. Where 10 years ago, face recognition was down in the 60, 70%. And now some of the matchers are up in the high 90s%. And so there's a lot of matchers out there, there's a much more varied ways of getting a face match than what's standard now in fingerprint, but it's in the mid-90s, roughly mid-90s for accuracy.
I hope it's better than it used to be. In the early days, I fooled a facial recognition system by putting on a hat and sunglasses, but that was a long time ago. We want to take your questions from the audience here. Somebody, I see a hand up over here, or perhaps people with a microphone have identified someone else. Tell us who you are, who you're with.
Thanks. Marian Backstrom, Inside Cybersecurity. So the other panelists, and you yourself, talked a little bit about the increased attack surface from using this technology. Can you walk us through a little bit more your processes for checking in with maybe other people at the department, I don't know, the Risk Management Center or others, about how you control for spoofing and other sorts of exploits?
Well, a lot of the spoofing is done at the collection site, and again, we don't collect. Our office is responsible for the storage, the matching, some analysis, and then we send that result back. So it's that agent on the ground that's doing the collecting and then getting the result back. So there have been times when with fingerprints, if we get indications that say it's an altered fingerprint, there are in fact doctors that will come up from South America into the U.S. and provide an operation for people to alter their fingerprints, okay? And we're beginning to pick up on those. So we feed that back to the folks that provide our matcher. We feed that back to the, if it's Border Patrol, hey, Border Patrol, looks like you're getting someone who's actively trying to spoof the system. In a way, it reminds me, for those that go back to the 80s, it's an arms race. So there's no single perfect biometric, okay? That's why depending on the use, the application, we need to find the best biometric, or in some cases, fusion, okay? Because as what I foresee, back to the screening for bad actors, we're going to be picking up biometrics probably at a distance and on the move. So it won't be a mugshot, it'll be, an off-axis picture of a face. And if that's a lower accuracy, we may have to combine that with gait or some other features that we see from the folks, all toward driving toward a greater accuracy for positive identification. Did that answer your question?
Another question.
Hi, Griffin Murphy, National Academy of Social Insurance. So we could imagine a situation in the future where maybe a malintentioned regime or individual were to rise into power. Presumably they would have access to this information. And if you were a journalist trying to report on the atrocities of this individual or group, and they had access to your location, in the worst case of scenarios, you'd see them tracking you down and trying to threaten you or do these sorts of things to you. So you say, are they a threat or not? In that case, this journalist would be a threat to the regime in power. And you're saying you're collecting the data for a certain use. If a regime were to come in power and want to change that use to something more malicious, that seems like a major problem. So how valid is this concern, and is this something you guys discuss at the DHS?
Well, it ranges, what you're getting at in a way is an insider threat. Now you've got low-level people who just want to do harm, and there are systems in place, but I can't really get into the details on how we would track that to minimize somebody on the inside trying to do harm. This is a different angle. What you're saying is elections, new people come in and they find out about the database and how can we use it differently. And I go back to the systems that we have in place. If we're going to access the data, it's all done through policy approval, privacy approval, and then those words are programmed into the system so that only certain people can see that data. And through those systems that we have that are improved and enforced, do we ensure that the wrong people don't gain access to that data?
So bottom line, you're saying more benefit than risk.
More benefit than risk. That's correct.
And we have to leave it there. John Boyd, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much.
Up next, a look at the global race for AI. Please welcome Paul DeBar, Undersecretary for Science at the Department of Energy. And welcome back, the Atlantic's Ross Anderson.
All right, Paul, thank you for being here this morning. The Department of Energy, as we were just discussing backstage, is sort of misnamed. It's responsible for a big part of the research portfolio in the sciences more generally outside of energy than most people understand, which means I get to ask Paul some hot questions here about the kind of the larger strategic landscape around science funding. Let's start with this. I want to get into some particulars as to how we're positioned relative to China in the race for AI, as we might think of it. But first, can you just talk a little bit about how important it is that we not fall behind China when it comes to AI research?
Yeah. So let me give you just a couple of points about the department, because the scope is actually the answer to the question about why is it important. So the Department of Energy runs the National Lab Complex, which has broad history. It was effectively started by a recommendation from Albert Einstein around, which became the Manhattan Project, and the 17 national labs that we're lucky to run it came out of that, and it's 60,000 researchers, and it's the largest generator of Nobel Prize winners in the world. Which again starting to get to your question. And so there's three primary missions across the National Lab Complex, and that's SLAC and Lawrence Berkeley and Los Alamos and Brookhaven and Oak Ridge and Fermi and so on, which is energy research, general science research, and defense programs, which is a bit of the history, obviously, from the Manhattan Project. So the importance of computing across all three of those missions of our very broad research portfolio is incredibly important. Obviously, we've been at the lead of supercomputing since the Cray 1 and the advent of supercomputing. The DOE and the National Lab Complex this last year, we commissioned the #1 supercomputer in the world, including by far the most powerful AI machine in the world, called Summit at Oak Ridge. We commissioned the #2 supercomputer in the world at Lawrence Livermore. We have 5 of the top 10 in the world, all 5 in the United States of the top supercomputers are at the National Labs.
Can you give us a sense of, for the most powerful supercomputer that you just commissioned, what are the new capabilities and in particular with AI that machine is going to allow you to?
So a little bit like Department of Defense works with the Boeings of the world to drive the next capabilities of an airplane, a fighter jet. We're at the front end of the world of working with the chip companies and the architecture companies to drive the next architecture and to invent the next chips that have not been invented yet. So I'll give you an example of capabilities on Summit, which is the current #1 supercomputer in the world, which from an ExaOps point of view, so from an AI image capture point of view, is by far more powerful than anything else in the world. So not just speed, but also speed at AI. And so basically Jensen Huang at CEO of NVIDIA, basically came up with the idea that his technology that he'd been using for video games could be used for image capture for AI applications. Basically, he came to us and effectively convinced us over a long period of time of a very technical review of what could possibly be done with GPUs. And for us to get comfortable, for us to fund NVIDIA, for them to do their first scale shift of their technology, their GPU technology, into supercomputing, and then to work with, in that case, IBM on architecture to develop a heterogeneous architecture that had both CPUs and GPUs for the first time at scale to build this top-end computer. And so it's truly exciting, when we have already 3 that we're building to top that. Yeah. So that's kind of how we work with the tech industry and computers and AI hardware developers.
Let's talk about China specifically. Given that for all the reasons you just mentioned, obviously everyone in this room is concerned about energy, about the progress of science, and certainly about defense. Where is China stronger than the U.S.? Are they stronger than the U.S. anywhere in the artificial intelligence space?
Yeah, so I'll start where we're strongest, and I can comment to where I think they're putting a lot of effort into it. So we're clearly the #1 in hardware. We know how to make semiconductor chips. Our designers are at the top end. The innovation coming out of the valley in terms of TPUs and where we're going with quantum accelerators and so on, much longer conversations, is clearly in the lead. And we can build the top end machines of the world, and we continue to do that and innovate around that. I think another thing that we do, and the way I like to think about, how do we make them worthwhile? Hardware is wonderful, but it's just looking at a box. If you don't know actually how to develop algorithms to run operating systems for AI, in this case AI operating systems, and you don't have subject matter experts to have problems to go solve, and how do you have that culture to pull people together around capabilities, hardware capabilities, operating system, and the problem solver, and how do you model that together? We're clearly in the lead. That's a cultural topic. The National Lab Complex and the 60,000 people that work there, the culture of that came from the Manhattan Project, and the culture of that was not a chemistry problem, and not a physics problem, and not a materials problem. It was a goal that they were going after and bringing people from cross disciplines to go attack a problem.
Sure.
And so, to be direct, the Chinese try to copy our national lab system. They try to copy Silicon Valley. They haven't done that.
But it's early days, right?
But it's a cultural point.
Sure.
And I'll let other people think about whether the sort of cooperative research which has been going on in Europe and in the United States for decades, and how that culture developed, which was started by Rutherford and Cambridge and so on over the course of decades and decades from the 1800s, whether that culture can actually evolve. Where they are, I think, good at is collecting data.
Yeah.
And data is important somewhat for AI. Clearly, looking at trends of data is a very important application of AI, and how to get use out of that, which is a very, very, very broad topic. But there's many applications of the AI which are beyond recognition of patterns. And I won't dive into it, but those are things that we're already moving into the next phase of AI beyond pattern recognition.
Is it possible that, and even taking on board your point that data collection isn't everything, that some of our advantages, whether they be cultural or just sort of first mover advantages, frankly, in the high-tech space, are going to be balanced out by just the utter lack of political constraints around data collection in China?
Yeah, I mean, clearly being able to collect data on genomics, collect data on how people move, which gets to security issues, which is interesting in a not very positive way. Clearly can be done if you don't have the legal structures in place around the sanctity of data and privacy. And I think when you have a different political and legal environment around privacy and how you look at that, which I think there's some downsides to that. Speaking as an American and as a first generation American, that there's some advantages around not having those legal structures. I think there's a broader piece for the United States around the importance of that.
I've read recently that Chinese researchers have this advantage because they can attend, international conferences on AI development and sort of learn from the state of the art. Everyone's reading the same papers, but then Chinese language conferences are not that they're not open to Western researchers, but very few Western researchers speak Mandarin, and so there's not a two-way exchange of knowledge. And in fact, I know that the Department of Energy has employed some restrictions on some of the work that Chinese nationals can be done. Is this something you guys have to think about more and more?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. One, the history and the current operations of our giant national lab complex and all our interactions with the university systems in the United States is based upon open science, transnational, merit-based access. So if you go to Lawrence Berkeley or Oak Ridge and want to use a computing system, a light source, one of our high energy particle physics giant accelerators, it doesn't matter whether you're working at a university in Germany and you're a German, or you're from Canada, or you're an American at Princeton. You're going to get access to our lab and our lab facilities based on merit, not based on what your passport is. And so that's an important part. I think our engagement, which is increasing. I'm about to go to Brussels to meet with all the lab directors of Europe in the EU in Brussels, and we're sitting down to go through ESA, which is their NASA, going through CERN, all the major facilities, and talking about how do we continue to accelerate. I think clearly China looks at the rest of the world and their engagement on open science that was once again founded in Europe by over 150 or so years ago, 130 years ago, in terms of where the culture came out of the universities in Europe, and the U.S. picked up on that. They don't have the same view of how to manage engagement in a collaborative manner on going back and forth the same way as the rest of the world does.
For now, they're that makes them kind of a minority player as their economy continues to grow and the world perhaps becomes more multipolar. Could you see a an almost Berlin Wall kind of going down the middle of the scientific enterprise at some point?
Well, I think it's up to them on how they want to engage with the rest of the world. It gets into broader issues about how they use science within their own country and the application of it. I think we do a lot of genomics work at the DOE National Labs. People don't realize that the Human Genome Project started at Lawrence Livermore Lab, which was a DOE lab. Genomics is, I think, as everyone's been reading here recently, including some points around NIH, there's broad issues, including potential negative issues that is around application of genomics and how we look at it and how Europe and the rest of the world besides China looks at it and how they look at it and applications that could get very problematic, much more than what people are reading about. So I could go through technology by technology, and I think it's really important for everyone to think about that. Once again, from our point of view, we're accelerating engagement with the vast majority of the world. And there's a very small, very, very small minority of number of countries that are looking at this differently.
I want to go to audience questions in a minute, but before I do that, I want to ask you about continuity and funding. I mean, the Department of Energy is one of the few players in the world that, along with NSF and a number of other institutions, that has to fund things in the very long term, such that you can't have kind of whiplash changes in funding environments for various technologies. However, I do wonder, this administration is headed by a president who's repeatedly called climate change a hoax. Has that affected, say, funding for alternative energy or anything else at DOE?
Yeah, so if you actually look at the budget, so the funding for the lab complex is up almost 25% since we came in as a leadership team, right? So that's a kind of a fact.
Sure.
And I can tell you firsthand the actual support for the sciences by us as a leadership team. And I think if you ask anyone up on the Hill, I think you'll get uniform kind of view about our support from Secretary Perry and the rest of us at the department and the National Lab Complex.
Sorry, you mean support for the scientific enterprise generally, or specifically climate science?
No, for science in general. And so there's been a massive increase, right, support for the sciences, including NSF, including NASA, including NIH.
Sure.
So I think it's important for everyone to kind of understand that. I mean, in general, this is a much longer conversation, but the law of the land is sequester and budget caps, and that's kind of been the requirements of budget proposals.
Sure.
But they've obviously been lifted, and that's why all the sciences across the federal footprint are actually up quite a bit. And I think everyone's very excited, whether you're NASA or NSF or so on NIH in terms of support. You asked about climate. It's a much longer conversation. So, from my point of view, the department has a long history the department, to a very large degree, is a very large R&D business.
Sure.
The vast majority of the people and the vast majority of the budget is for R&D. And so there's a long history of the department supporting development of technologies that, depending on the public policy, that are available for people to go execute. And the public policy might be a national public policy, it might be a state public policy, it might be an individual city, it might be a company, it might be other countries, right?
Right.
And so we developed technology, including around emissions, for decades. And I'm going to date myself a little bit, but for people who may remember, there was something called acid rain and NOx and SOx. And emissions from those created acid rain, and there were forests getting burned out in the United States and Europe. And the DOE National Lab Complex was a big supporter of emissions technologies that ultimately were commercialized, and we reduced emissions. We're working, and we talk all the time about developing technology solutions around carbon capture. We help drive solar costs down 90%. We help wind capacity factors. We're the largest on battery research in the world. These are all long conversations that I can't kind of get into. And so our goal is for us to provide technology solutions that could be applied to those emissions. And maybe the last thing that I would say, and I'm a technologist, right? I've run a large R&D business, is that mandates and taxes and incentives and these public policy positions are usually not permanent. When people come and go, and mandates come and change, and they go back and forth. But what's enduring is innovation and technology. And that's the real goal of the complex. That's the real goal of DOE, is to provide technology solutions for people who want to go try to implement it for what they're trying to get done.
Great. Let's go to a question. Got a microphone right here.
Hi. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. And I covered DOE back in the great days of the Win-Ho Lee crisis. So I know there's been a lot of back and forth on a security organization there. Let me ask, you mentioned the next generation of AI, that moving beyond the mere grinding of vast amounts of data into, some kind of data burger that is hopefully, sanitary and tasty. Talk about what the next generation is. I know DARPA's got a next gen AI project. I know lots of people talking about, can be combining expert systems with big data systems. What are you guys looking at as this next generation of AI that, among many other things, will make us a hard act to follow internationally?
Yeah, so great question. That's exactly one of the things that we're looking at. I have a number of my labs basically making proposals on that exact point of how to develop programs effectively on what's next. So as I was mentioning, that looking at data trends and and kind of data samples has great value.
Sure.
But what's actually interesting is building AI from a science and a research point of view, and to actually how do you use AI to help design a drug? How do you actually make it designed to look at materials in the cathode and anode in a battery at an individual atomic level? And how do you use AI to help design systems based on how based on your lab results and your modeling, to actually design individual materials, design individual pieces of kind of chemistry points to actually drive where you want to accomplish. So let me give you an example, a very practical example. So we do a lot of work on potential carbon capture materials. So one of the things that we're doing is effectively making films where carbon dioxide, right, will go through and the rest won't. It looks like a baghouse material if you're thinking about ash collection and so on. We have materials, we have a research string in which we might be able to get that, which is a very simple design. We need to drive down costs. We're targeting $30 a ton. Okay, so a lot of people talk about $100, $140, $200 ton capture of carbon. It's just really expensive. If we're successful, we're actually doing something which actually can make economic sense potentially with what everyone's discussing. Well, we're able at one of our labs, this is a real research string that we have going on, where we have over 1 million different compounds which we could come up with that could screen porosity and a number of other kind of areas to kind of look at for the materials for that. But you can't take 1 million different materials into the lab and do physical testing, right? That's just not going to work. So using either machine learning, or once again, as we develop AI applications for science around physics or biology, around designing things, is using that to actually get the computer, right, and the algorithm to give us answers on, okay, these are the 10 you really want to take to the lab. These are the highest probabilities. And so I'm giving one very specific answer, but it could be in any chemistry question or any materials question or on containment for fusion or in genomics.
Paul, thanks for being with us this morning. That was fascinating.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Ross, for that fascinating conversation. And of course, thank you to all of our speakers and moderators today. We want to do a special thank you to Microsoft. Again, if you haven't checked out their display behind you there, I encourage you to do that. And thank you for their support of today's programming. Before you go, I have one quick favor. If you look at all of your chairs, you'll see a quick survey there. You'll also receive one in the email. We are actively soliciting your thoughts and feedback as we work to make these programs as important and impactful as possible. Promise it will take just a few moments of your time. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and have a great day.